Okay, this week we are going to look at the beginning of the New Kingdom. And I've given you the dates here when the entire New Kingdom was in existence, about 1550 to 1096 or 1069 BC, and it covered the 18th to the 20th dynasties. This was a pretty incredible time, at least in the beginning, for ancient Egypt. We have quite a few sources this time, which is always nice. Inscriptions, writing and papyri, which we'll talk about, another pyramid town, which we'll focus on next week, and of course, along with this, lots of archaeology. Now, we talked a little bit about what was happening in the Second Intermediate Period, and especially looked at what had happened, or what probably happened, with Sennacherib II. If you remember, he was the one that was probably captured in battle and then tortured and killed. We also talked a little bit about Kamos and what he was doing in terms of recapturing both the north and south of Egypt. Now it's interesting, so Kamos is the son. Many Egyptologists see the next ruler, Ahmose, as being the beginning of the New Kingdom, although it's hard to say. Kamos really did quite a bit of the work to set the stage. It's possible that Ahmose was also his younger brother. It's not quite clear from the text. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the New Kingdom period is really the glory days. And what I'll do is I'll show you some of the places where they expanded to, and then lots of the places that they were trading with. It's also a time when you might have heard some of these pharaohs who were living during this time. Hatshepsut, which is she was an Egyptian queen. We've got Akhenaten, which you may not have heard too much about. It depends on how deep you've been looking at Egyptian history in the past. Of course, almost everyone has heard of King Tut, and then Ramses II is probably the famous pharaoh that shows up in the Old Kingdom. It's interesting that the time that the New Kingdom was being formed and became this large, you've got also lots of other kingdoms growing, especially in the Middle East. And I've given you the names of some of these. And many of these civilizations or kingdoms will come in contact with the Egyptians during this time. Now, we've already looked at the Second Intermediate Period and what was going on with all of the warfare. We find that during the New Kingdom, what really happens is that they expand and take over territories that they controlled before, and then push even further north into the areas Palestine, Israel, modern-day Palestine, Israel, and so on. We find, of course, we all know that Nubia was a very rich territory, especially with gold, and so they were moving into Nubia again and retaking a lot of that. And it's interesting, if you like looking at the history of warfare, the chariot was introduced into the New Kingdom during this period, and they start using it in their warfare. Now, when you get to the beginning of the New Kingdom, what the Egyptians had to focus on was kicking out the Hyksos, who were in control in the north. And we know that Ahmose started this process. He at least went in and destroyed a major fort in Avaris. And then what he ended up doing is creating a military base. And we've talked about sustainability quite a bit in this class. To feed all the troops, you have to have grain silos. So it's probably no big surprise. What is interesting is that many of the soldiers that were fighting for Ahmose were from Nubia. So they were paying people from Nubia to fight for them in the northern part of Egypt. Now you probably can't see, this is from your atlas, and let me grab my pen here. So we know that Ahmose attacked the Hyksos fortress at Sharunin, and you can see here where I just circled it. And what he ended up doing is pushing into further north. And they've got widespread destruction. If you remember, I talked about during the Second Intermediate Period how we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence for this period. It's because of what Kamos and Ahmose ended up doing, is that when they kicked out the Hyksos, they destroyed their buildings and then built over top of that. And we also know that Ahmose went and pushed further south. We talked about the fortress at Buhan, and then really went further south. So this is when Egypt starts to recontrol and he ended up recontrolling areas in Nubia. And sort of just like what happened in the Middle Kingdom, you get a series of pharaohs who take each other's names. So you've got Thutmose I, and then it continues second, third, and fourth. Now, what's really interesting is if you read some of the texts that surround this particular area, you've got stories of Thutmose I who pushed deep into Nubia, into the Kerma territory, and then captured the Nubian king and then strung him up. So there are some stories about the takeover. And then here's a map, again, from the Atlas, and it's showing you how far Egyptian troops traveled into Nubia. And this purple area is where the Egyptians were taking over. And what they ended up doing is, if you remember, we talked about how the Egyptians created nomes to help control Egypt and govern Egypt. What they ended up doing is using Nubian rulers as vassals. And vassals are people who are under the control of the Egyptians, and essentially it helped enlarge the Egyptian state. We know that Thutmose I, who is also, we just talked about pushing into Nubia, he pushed deep into Asia, or what we call Asia, like modern-day Palestine, Syria, Israel, Lebanon. During this period in Palestine, there were a series of city-states, and we haven't really talked about that. What they really are small kingdoms. And so you've got a city that's governed by a king, and then the territory or the state surrounding it. They weren't really organized as a government because they had separate kings. And they were always in the way of, like, Egypt in the south pushing up, and then these big kingdoms pushing north. So the Palestinians were always, their city-states were always getting involved with wars outside of their control. We've got knowledge on a group called the Mitanni, and they also deal with the Egyptians. And we also know that the Egyptians were dealing with the Minoans. These were a group of people in the Aegean and had a fairly large civilization, and they were definitely trading with the Minoans during this time, because we see not only Minoan artifacts in Egypt during this time, but we see Egyptian artifacts in the Minoan state. We also know that the Egyptians were traveling deep into an area called Punt. We're not quite sure exactly where that is, but what's most interesting about this experience or exploration into Punt is that we finally have a very famous queen named Hatshepsut. And I've given you her dates here for when she was alive. She's really interesting because a lot of the pictures depict her with a beard. And so she was depicted as a male, and she was a pharaoh. And she had to solidify her power by appearing as a man. And if you remember, when we were looking at the Middle Kingdom, I showed you a bit of the tomb of Amenhotep II, and I mentioned that his tomb was right, or his temple complex was right next to Queen Hatshepsut's, or Pharaoh Hatshepsut's. And then this is her temple that she built next to it, this much grander temple. And then here you can see, so this ramp that leads up into the rooms that were built into the side of the cliff. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to spend on Hatshepsut, but after her death, there was quite a bit of destruction of her images. And you can't quite see it, but what they've done is they scraped off part of her image here. And then we've got the destruction of her cartouche here, where they've scraped off her name. So what the Egyptians later tried to do is erase her history, which of course didn't quite work. And this is mostly done by Thutmose III. He's pretty interesting because we have a very large amount of texts that talk about his battles. Now, you have to be careful when you read these texts because they're obviously written to glorify the Egyptian pharaoh and may not tell us exactly what was going on. One example is this battle at Megiddo, and I'll show you the map in just a bit. We know that several vassals rebelled against Egyptian rule, and then he had to go in and fight against them. And he invaded all the way up into the Euphrates River. And we know that during this period that Egypt had sort of diplomatic relations with a number of different civilizations like the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Hittites. They were all dealing with Egypt during this period. And this is a map showing some of the extent of the range that Thutmose III went. So here is a bit of the description of Megiddo, and that's down here. You'd have to look in your map book to see all this. But you can see where he traveled, way fighting and dealing with the northern neighbors. Now, the next pharaoh to rule was Amenhotep II, and this is when things started to calm down. And this is really the beginning of the glory days, where you've got the Egyptians having diplomatic relations, and that always means trade. So lots of wealth was moving into Egypt, and lots of wealth was moving back out. You've got the next ruler, Thutmose IV. He makes a peace treaty. He ends up marrying a Mitanni princess. He was marrying lots of women at this particular time. And then you've got, probably one of the reasons why this is happening is that the Hittites and Assyrians were threatening the Mitanni. So they were trying to build up relations with Egypt, who was a fairly big military power at this time. We also have the start of what's called the Valley of the Kings, which is where all of the pharaohs were being buried during this time. And I've given you a link here now. Of course, this is a recording, so it's not live, so I will pop it in our class so that you can look at some of the archaeology being done during this time. We then move into a really interesting period, especially in terms of religion in ancient Egypt, with the next pharaoh, Amenhotep III. He started to worship the solar god named Aten. Here you've got an image with his queen, and down here you can see his daughter between them. Their names, probably no big surprise because I talked about how there was so much trade going on with Egypt. Their names appear in the Aegean sites. So they had lots of influence, lots of trade going on during this period. Probably some of the more famous archaeological remains from Amenhotep III are these massive, what they're called colossi. These massive statues, they're 65 feet tall. And I think towards the beginning of class, I sent you an article on more statues that are being discovered of his. So lots of effort was put into building these statues, as you can imagine, moving the stones and then carving them and all the other things that, of course, relate to sustainability that we've been talking about. Right after that, you've got Amenhotep IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten. And you can see here, Aten, that's the name of the solar disk god. He's got a very famous queen, Nefertiti. And what happens during his reign is you get a total worship of the sun god. And what he ends up doing is building a new capital, Amarna, and they start a process of trying to get rid of all the old gods from Egypt and have everyone worship this one God. It's an interesting time period because some scholars who look at monotheism, or the idea of one God, sort of point back to this particular period to maybe start this process or be involved in the process of having many gods down to one God. What we'll talk about next is the building of the Amarna, and we'll look at some of the social justice issues that pop up with the people who are forced to build his new capital city.